Balaam was a wicked prophet in the Bible, who is notable because while he was wicked, he was not a false prophet. That is, Balaam did hear from God and was given true prophecies to speak. Balaam's heart, however, was not right with God, and he eventually revealed his true colors by betraying Israel and leading them astray. The crisis occurred while the Israelites were in Moab's plains. They had encountered numerous foes and had won a number of battles along the way. They desired to take the main route through Edom. Despite their historical ties, Edom was descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. Their request was denied. They were confident after a battle in which God gave them victory over Edom and Moab. They camped near the Jordan River, looking across to the Promised Land. However, there was some opposition to their advance on Canaan. The people of Ammon and Moab, who owned land bordering the Promised Land, decided to derail their plans and hired a Syrian soothsayer to accomplish their goal. Balaam was the name of this Damascene soothsayer. He'd made a name for himself by witnessing the defeats of armies he'd cursed. Then the Israelites traveled to the plains of Moab and camped along the Jordan across from Jericho. Numbers, chapter 22, verse 1. The Israelites eventually arrived near the Jordan River, across from the city of Jericho. The book of Deuteronomy, as well as the book of Joshua, begin here. However, rather than covering the more famous events that were to come, the next several chapters of Numbers follow the actions of two men named Balak and Balaam. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde is going to lick up everything around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." So Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Pethor, near the Euphrates River, in his native land. Balak said, "A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." Numbers chapter 22, verses 2 through 6. Moab's king was Balak, son of Zippor. He had witnessed what had occurred to the Amorites, and his people were terrified of the Israelites. As a result, the king decided to hire Balaam, son of Beor, to come and curse the people of Israel in order for Moab to defeat them. In an area where the false god Baal was worshipped, Balaam was essentially a prophet for hire. So Balak sent messengers to Balaam, requesting that he come and curse these people. "I am aware that those you bless are blessed, while those you curse are cursed." Balaam apparently had a reputation for achieving results through the words he spoke. But the Lord had a perfect reputation. If he says something will happen, it will happen. This is significant because God had promised Abraham many years before that he would make him into a great nation. He would bless those who bless Abraham and curse anyone who treats Abraham with contempt. Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through 3. These promises would be extended to Abraham's blood descendants, the Israelites. Balak's plan was thus doomed from the start. If God is determined to bless you, no one's words can override him. The elders of Moab and Midian left, taking with them the fee for divination. When they came to Balaam, they told him what Balak had said. "Spend the night here," Balaam said to them, "and I will report back to you with the answer the Lord gives me." So the Moabite officials stayed with him. God came to Balaam and asked, "Who are these men with you?" Balaam said to God, "Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent me this message. A people that has come out of Egypt covers the face of the land. Now come and put a curse on them for me. Perhaps then I will be able to fight them and drive them away." But God said to Balaam, Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed. Numbers chapter 22, verses 7 through 12. Balak dispatched elders from Moab and Midian to Balaam with divination fees in hand. It's worth noting that despite practicing God-forbidden forms of sorcery, Balaam refused to accompany these men until he received a response from the Lord. The implication appears to be that he intended to do whatever God told him to do, regardless of how good the money was, which he did at every point in the story. So that night, God graciously condescended to appear to this sorcerer, who generally was not committed to living in a manner pleasing to him. See Revelations chapter 2, verse 14, and asked, "Who are these men with you?" Numbers chapter 22, verse 9. Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. Balaam relayed what he had been asked to do to Israel, and God warned him not to curse his people, whom he had blessed. The next morning, Balaam got up and said to Balak's officials, "Go back to your own country, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you." So the Moabite officials returned to Balak and said, "Balaam refused to come with us." Then Balak sent other officials, more numerous and more distinguished than the first. They came to Balaam and said, "This is what Balak, son of Zippor, says. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Come and put a curse on these people for me." But Balaam answered them, "Even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Now spend the night here so that I can find out what else the Lord will tell me." That night God came to Balaam and said, "Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you." Numbers chapter 22, verses 13 through 20. Balaam did as he was told, and sent his guests away empty-handed. But Balak would not accept no for an answer. He sent officials who were more numerous and higher in rank than the others, promising an even greater reward if Balaam would curse Israel as requested. Balaam's donkey. Balaam got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him. Balaam was riding his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Numbers chapter 22, verses 21 through 22. While Balaam and his donkey were on their way to meet Balak, they encountered God, who was so enraged that Balaam was going to Moab, that he appeared in the road as the angel of the Lord to oppose him. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15, we learn what prompted this unexpected reaction. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15, New International Version. They have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness. It says Balaam loved the wages of wickedness. So, despite his claims to follow the Lord's instructions, which he did when it suited him, it appears that Balaam was a mercenary prophet at heart. Though God had given Balaam permission to accompany the elders of Moab, God knew that the man had no regard for Israel and was willing to curse Israel for the reward, despite God's instructions. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, it turned off the road into a field. Balaam beat it to get it back on the road. Then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path through the vineyards with walls on both sides. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. So he beat the donkey again. Then the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no room to turn, either to the right or to the left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam, and he was angry and beat it with his staff. Then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Balaam answered the donkey, You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." The donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" "No," he said. Numbers chapter 22, verses 23 through 30. This duplicity within the prophet resulted in the peculiar and amusing scene between an animal with keen spiritual sense and a human being who was spiritually as dumb as a rock. Balaam's donkey was scared off the road when he saw the angel, standing on the path with a drawn sword in his hand. Balaam hit her to return her to the path, eager to get his payday. God unexpectedly and supernaturally opened the donkey's mouth after this situation repeated itself twice. She inquired, "What have I done to you that you have beaten me 3 times?" Don't miss the conversation that follows between a faithful donkey and an unfaithful prophet. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his sword drawn. So he bowed low and fell face down. The angel of the Lord asked him, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If it had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now, but I would have spared it." Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned. I did not realize you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now if you are displeased, I will go back." The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." So Balaam went with Balak's officials. Numbers chapter 22, verses 31 through 35. Finally, God opened Balaam's eyes to see the angel of the Lord who was blocking his path. As Balaam lay face down in worship, the Lord explained to the prophet that his dumb donkey had saved his life. Balaam, dissatisfied, began to think clearly and offered to turn around and go home. But God had decided to show his glory to the Moabites and Midianites while also blessing his people through Balaam. So he told him to accompany the men, but to say only what God had told him to say. When Balak heard that Balaam was coming, he went out to meet him at the Moabite town on the Arnon border, at the edge of his territory. Balak said to Balaam, "Did I not send you an urgent summons? Why didn't you come to me? Am I really not able to reward you?" "Well, I have come to you now," Balaam replied, "but I can't say whatever I please. I must speak only what God puts in my mouth." Then Balaam went with Balak to Kiriath-Huzoth. Balak sacrificed cattle and sheep, and gave some to Balaam and the officials who were with him. The next morning Balak took Balaam up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he could see the outskirts of the Israelite camp. Numbers chapter 22, verses 36 through 41. Balak had been waiting for Balaam for quite some time. He was trembling in his sandals at the sight of the Israelite horde camped in the desert on the outskirts of his homeland, ready to devour his culture like a swarm of locusts on a barley crop. As a result, he was a little tense when Balaam finally arrived. Balaam, on the other hand, was unfazed by Balak's irritation. He even forewarned him that he would only say what God put in his mouth. Balak ignored this, offered a sacrifice to his false god Baal, and rushed Balaam to a location known as Bamoth Baal, or the high places of Baal. Balak was thus summoning an idol to curse Israel, and expecting Balaam to act as his spiritual megaphone. Balaam said, "Build me 7 altars here, and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams for me." Balak did as Balaam said, and the 2 of them offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Then Balaam said to Balak, "Stay here beside your offering while I go aside. Perhaps the Lord will come to meet with me. Whatever he reveals to me, I will tell you." Then he went off to a barren height. Numbers chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. When they arrived, Balaam instructed Balak to construct 7 altars and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams. After that, they offered the sacrifices. Then Balaam instructed Balak to remain behind while he went to a barren hill in search of the message that the Lord might have him deliver. This is incredible. Balaam repeatedly stated that he could do nothing without the approval of God, the Creator God, whom the Israelites worshipped, and yet Balak never objected or complained, saying, "What are you doing consulting with the God of the Israelites? They are the adversaries I am paying you to curse." Clearly, he didn't believe the Lord's word on the matter. Clearly, he put little stock in the Lord's say in the matter. God met with him, and Balaam said, "I have prepared 7 altars, and on each altar I have offered a bull and a ram." The Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, "Go back to Balak and give him this word." So he went back to him and found him standing beside his offering with all the Moabite officials. Then Balaam spoke his message. "Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, from the eastern mountains. Come," he said, "curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them. From the heights I view them. I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number even a fourth of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and may my final end be like theirs." Numbers chapter 23, verses 4 through 10. God did meet with Balaam, essentially putting a message in his mouth for Balak, who was waiting for the prophet to return with all the officials of Moab. The first of Balaam's 4 poetic messages, or oracles, of blessing on Israel was then delivered. First, he reminded himself why he was there. He'd been summoned to condemn Israel. However, he questioned how anyone could curse someone whom God had not cursed, and denounce someone whom the Lord had not denounced. Then he reflected on Israel's vast population, a fact that was almost certainly common knowledge, and declared that even being identified with Israel in death was a blessing. Balak said to Balaam, "What have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them." He answered, "Must I not speak what the Lord puts in my mouth?" Numbers chapter 23, verses 11 through 12. This was clearly not what Balak had in mind when he hired Balaam to curse his adversary. He was taken aback by what came out of the man's mouth and felt betrayed. He said, "I brought you to curse my enemies, but look at how you've blessed them." Balaam's only response was, "Shouldn't I say exactly what the Lord puts in my mouth?" That should have been the end of Balak's bad idea, the point at which he dropped the subject. But he wasn't willing to give up. Surely the money he had promised the prophet would eventually persuade him to comply. Balaam's second message. Then Balak said to him, "Come with me to another place where you can see them. You will not see them all, but only the outskirts of their camp, and from there curse them for me." So he took him to the field of Zophim on the top of Pisgah, and there he built 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Balaam said to Balak, "Stay here beside your offering, while I meet with him over there." The Lord met with Balaam and put a word in his mouth, and said, "Go back to Balak and give him this word." So he went to him and found him standing beside his offering with the Moabite officials. Balak asked him, "What did the Lord say?" Numbers chapter 23, verses 13 through 17. Balak reasoned that a change of scenery would be beneficial to Balaam. So the Moabite king took the sorcerer to Lookout Field, on the top of Mount Pisgah, where Balak built 7 altars and sacrificed a bull and a ram on each in the hopes of convincing his God to curse Israel. Balaam went off on his own once more to seek the Lord, who placed a message in his mouth. Surprisingly, when the prophet returned, Balak even inquired, "What did the Lord say?" He evidently hoped that the God of the Israelites would finally decide to curse his own people. Then he spoke his message. "Arise, Balak, and listen. Hear me, son of Zippor. God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot change it." Numbers chapter 23, verses 18 through 20. Balaam responded with another poetic blessing for Israel, beginning with a personalized call that should have made the king take a breather. Balak, get up and listen. Son of Zippor, pay attention to what I say. The idolatrous prophet then uttered a glorious declaration of God's immutable nature, inspired by the Holy Spirit. Balaam had been given the command to bless Israel because of who God is and the promises he has made. In other words, since God had decreed blessing for his people, Balaam had no recourse. He explained he couldn't change it. No misfortune is seen in Jacob, no misery observed in Israel. The Lord their God is with them. The shout of the king is among them. Verse 22. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. Verse 23. There was no divination against Jacob, no evil omens against Israel. It will now be said of Jacob and of Israel, see what God has done. Verse 24. The people rise like a lioness. They rouse themselves like a lion. That does not rest till it devours its prey and drinks the blood of its victims. Verse 25. Then Balak said to Balaam, neither curse them at all, nor bless them at all. Verse 26. Balaam answered, did I not tell you I must do whatever the Lord says? Numbers chapter 23, verses 21 through 26. Balaam went on to say that since God brought Israel out of Egypt, the nation had the strength of a wild ox. She was a force against which no magic curse or divination like the kind of tricks Balak was trying to employ could work against her. Chapter 23, verses 22 through 23. When Balaam had finished this speech, Balak basically said to him, look, if you can't say something bad about Israel, don't say anything at all. Chapter 23, verse 25. But in this matter, Balaam was working for a higher king. Chapter 23, verse 26. Balaam's third message. Verse 27. Then Balak said to Balaam, come, let me take you to another place. Perhaps it will please God to let you curse them for me from there. Verse 28. And Balak took Balaam to the top of Peor, overlooking the wasteland. Verse 29. Balaam said, build me 7 altars here, and prepare 7 bulls and 7 rams for me. Verse 30. Balak did as Balaam had said, and offered a bull and a ram on each altar. Numbers chapter 23, verses 27 through 30. Balak appears to have been either a slow learner or a desperate leader, and he was willing to give his plan a third try. He escorted Balaam to a third location. Maybe it will be acceptable to God if you put a curse on them for me there, he reasoned. People in the ancient Near East, where these men lived, believed that certain gods had power over specific geographical areas. This makes it less surprising that Balak believed a change in location would change the results he was hearing. But he'd never been asked to curse Israel, because as he explained to those who hired him, he could only say what God told him to say. It was customary for a soothsayer to curse the opposing party before a battle, so Balaam was asked to curse the Israelites. His only motivation was the fee he would be paid. He, on the other hand, proved incapable of cursing Israel and instead blessed her. He couldn't stop himself. Balaam declares that God will bless and multiply Israel. The account also includes the incredible story of the talking ass who refuses to move when he sees an angel in his path. Balaam beats the ass for refusing to move, and the ass finally tells him why. Those who question whether this occurred should remember that animals can be possessed by both evil and good spirits. 2 biblical examples are the serpent in the Garden of Eden and Jesus casting demons into the pigs. The message is clear. The animal understands more than Balaam. Now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not resort to divination, as at other times, but turned his face toward the wilderness. When Balaam looked out and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came on him, and he spoke his message. The prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eyes see clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. Numbers chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. This time, Balaam broke the pattern by simply looking out over Israel, which was encamped below, according to the meticulous plan God had devised. chapter 21, verse 1. See commentary on Numbers chapter 1, verses 47 through 50. Numbers chapter 1, verses 47 through 50, New King James Version. But the Levites were not numbered among them by their father's tribe. For the Lord had spoken to Moses, saying, Only the tribe of Levi you shall not number, nor take a census of them among the children of Israel. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, over all its furnishings, and over all things that belong to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They shall attend to it, and camp around the tabernacle. The Spirit of God descended on him when he saw the vast nation encamped tribe by tribe. The prophet then described the Lord's influence on him. His eyes were opened. He heard God's words. He saw a vision from God, and he fell into a trance with his eyes open. Balaam uttered his third oracle in this state, another poetic tribute to God's hand of blessing on Israel. How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from their buckets. Their seed will have abundant water. Their king will be greater than Agag. Their kingdom will be exalted. Numbers chapter 24, verses 5 through 7. Though he saw Israel as a nomadic city of tents, he saw it as a beautiful land of abundance and prosperity. He also referred to Israel as a kingdom, despite the fact that their first king, Saul, would not rule for hundreds of years. The mention of Agag is interesting. During King Saul's reign, the prophet Samuel would execute Agag, a future Amalekite king. However, in the ancient Near East, kings frequently bore the same throne name for decades, as in the case of Egypt's Pharaoh or Philistia's Abimelech. As a result, Amalek's current king most likely bore the name Agag as well. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. They devour hostile nations and break their bones in pieces. With their arrows they pierce them. Like a lion they crouch and lie down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse them? May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed. Numbers chapter 24, verses 8 through 9. Balaam emphasized God's strength in bringing Israel out of Egypt and defeating enemy nations ahead of them in the rest of the oracle. The latter was exactly what Balak feared. Balaam ended with a chilling proclamation, "Those who curse Israel will be cursed." King Balak had sealed his own fate by attempting to curse Israel. Then Balak's anger burned against Balaam. He struck his hands together and said to him, "I summoned you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them these 3 times." Verse 11. Now leave at once and go home. I said I would reward you handsomely, but the Lord has kept you from being rewarded. Balaam answered Balak, Did I not tell the messengers you sent me? Even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything of my own accord, good or bad, to go beyond the command of the Lord. And I must say only what the Lord says? Now I am going back to my people, but come, let me warn you of what this people will do to your people in days to come. Numbers chapter 24, verses 10 through 14. Finally, Balak had heard enough. He became enraged with Balaam and sent him home without paying him. Nonetheless, Balaam calmly repeated everything he had said about his obligation to say whatever God told him to say from the start. Balaam had one more oracle of blessing for Israel, and a word of warning for Balak, before the 2 men parted ways. Then he spoke his message. The prophecy of Balaam, son of Beor, the prophecy of one whose eye sees clearly, the prophecy of one who hears the words of God, who has knowledge from the Most High, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Seir, his enemy, will be conquered. But Israel will grow strong. A ruler will come out of Jacob and destroy the survivors of the city. Then Balaam saw Amalek and spoke his message. Amalek was first among the nations, but their end will be utter destruction. Then he saw the Kenites and spoke his message. Your dwelling place is secure. Your nest is set in a rock. Yet you Kenites will be destroyed when Asshur takes you captive. Then he spoke his message. Alas, who can live when God does this? Ships will come from the shores of Cyprus. They will subdue Asshur and Eber, but they too will come to ruin. Then Balaam got up and returned home, and Balak went his own way. Then, with his mission complete, Balaam returned home, as did Balak. The cursing of Israel had failed.